In this video, we're going to be talking about how to write the implementation for this StepTracker class. So I've got the bare bones of a class, public class StepTracker, and let's go ahead and figure out all the things that we need to write within this StepTracker class for it to be complete. We know that we're going to want to write a constructor of some sort. We know this because the very first statement within the table of statements, we initialize a new StepTracker and it passes in the number of steps that are considered to be active. So for example, in that first statement, it says that it passes in 10,000, and that means that days that have at least 10,000 steps are considered active. So the constructor takes in number of steps to be considered active. Okay, so we have that. We also want to write three different methods. We have addDailySteps, which will takes in number of steps per day. We have activeDays, which returns the number of active days. And then last but not least, we have averageSteps, which returns the average number of steps per day, where we calculate this by dividing total number of steps divided by the number of days tracked. All right, so those are the four methods that we're going to be writing for this class. We will probably be having some sort of internal state within this class, and let's go ahead and see if we can figure out what that would be. So we know that there is this number of steps that is needed to be considered to be active. We're not just going to need this in the constructor, we're also going to need this for addDailySteps, where given some sort of number of steps per day, we will be incrementing how many days we were active. So we can write down min number of steps to be active as one of our fields, and then we're going to need to have a field for the number of active days. Make sure not to confuse this with the number of days total. So we know that every time we call the addDailySteps method, we're going to be incrementing the number of days that we have accumulated, but we're not necessarily always going to be incrementing this number of active days because it has to be greater than the minimum number of steps to be active. So we need to be tracking two different number of days here. Last but not least, we need to be tracking the total number of steps that the person has taken, because addDailySteps, we're going to be adding to this number so that we can get the average of the number of steps per day. That should be all the pseudocode. Let's go ahead and start implementing stuff. So we know that our fields within this class should probably be private. They should be restricted to the class itself. So we'll do private. The number of steps is going to be an integer. So int. How do I know it's an int? Well, notice within these statements, we're exclusively passing in integer values. We're not passing in doubles or any other value. So this is going to be int. Let's call this min active steps. And we don't want to initialize it because we're going to be doing that inside of our constructor. The next one, the number of active days. This is also going to be private, and this is also going to be an int. In this situation, each of our days is discrete. We will be using an int to represent the number of active days. Num active days. Number of days total, just like number of active days, this is also going to be a private int. You can call this total days. And then last but not least, we have the total number of steps, also going to be an int. Total num steps. So those are our fields. This will be keeping track of the state as we modify it with our methods. Let's go ahead and look at our constructor. So the constructor, we just do public and then the name of our object. So StepTracker. We don't need a return type for this because this is a constructor. When we create a StepTracker object, we are calling its constructor. The constructor actually passes in a value. So what is the type of that value? Well, it's going to be an int. And what's being passed in is the number of steps that someone needs to take to be considered active for that day. So int, let's call it num steps. And then within this constructor, we're going to be initializing our fields. So let's go ahead and set min active steps, our field, equal to num steps. If we had named this field num steps like this would be sort of confusing, so we would have had to prepend this, but since I named them two different things, You don't have to do that. I'd prefer this way, it's just a little bit more clear, but if you want to name them the same thing, make sure you have the this in front of it. What else do we need to do inside of this constructor? You might be tempted to just move on, but notice that these other 3 fields are not initialized yet. So we want to initialize them. So num active days. So we haven't had any active days yet. We're going to set this equal to 0. Total days, we haven't recorded any days yet because we haven't added any daily steps yet. So we're going to say total days is 0 as well. Then total num steps, once again, we haven't recorded any steps yet. We have only been given the number of steps it takes to be considered active, so we're going to set that equal to 0 as well. So now we've initialized all of our fields, and we have a number for the minimum number of active steps we need in a day for that day to have been considered active. So let's go ahead and move on to addDailySteps. So public, let's see, does this return anything? No, it does not. This is a void method. If it did return something, we would change this to be int or double or something like that. But since it's just modifying some state, we are not returning anything. So we int daily steps, and then we're passing in a parameter. This parameter is int that represents how many steps the person has taken in that day. So let's just call it int steps. And we want to do a few things inside of this method. Number 1 is we want to update our total number of steps method to include the number of steps we took in that day. So we can do something like this, where we're saying take the value of total number of steps and then add the number of steps we took in that day and set that equal to total number of steps again. You could write it like this if you wanted. I just prefer the former. It's a little bit cleaner. What else do we need to do here? Well, when we call addDailySteps, you can assume that another day has occurred. So we would increment total days as well. And then here is where we need to do some checking. So we don't necessarily know if this is an active day yet because we need to check if our number of steps was greater than our minimum active steps, greater than or equal to. So if steps is greater than or equal to min active steps, so if we took enough steps in that day for it to be active, we would also increment num active days. Like that. We will do both of these things regardless of whether we took enough steps in that day for it to be active. Next method is activeDays. So public activeDays does actually return something. It returns an int. I can tell this based on the value returned for each of the statements. ActiveDays, it doesn't take in any parameters, so we can leave that blank. This should return the number of active days. Luckily for us, we have a field that represents the number of active days, so we can just return that. Num active days, like that. And we have been incrementing this in addDailySteps, so this is really just a getter. And then moving on to the last method, averageSteps. This will return the average number of steps per day. Notice that we are now returning a double, so our return type is going to be a double. How do I know it's a double? Well, it's not an int, it's got that decimal point, and the name of the method, addDailySteps, and it doesn't take in any parameters, so we can go ahead and put the parentheses there like that. In this method, we want to return the average number of steps per day. What we're going to do is we're going to take our field that represents the total number of steps, and we're going to divide it by the number of days tracked, which is another field that we have. So divide by total days. You might be tempted to just leave it like this. However, total number of steps is an int, total days also an int. So what we're going to be doing here is integer division. That's not exactly what we want. To prevent this, we can multiply this first number by 1.0, which will convert it to a double. So then when we divide it by the total number of days, we are going to get a double as opposed to a truncated int by integer division. Think to yourself and think if you can see one more thing that's wrong with this implementation of addDailySteps. If you answered, what happens if total days is 0, you'd be absolutely correct. If total days is 0, you're going to get not a number because you're dividing by 0. So we also need to have a special case here for if total days equals 0. So in that case, we kind of just need to return a hard-coded value of 0.0 because we don't want it to reach this division where we're going to be dividing by 0. That should be it for our addDailySteps method. Now we're going to go ahead and go line by line and make sure that this method is actually performing like we anticipate it would, which I strongly recommend you do during your AP test. So the first thing we do inside of the statement is we create a new step tracker. We pass in 10,000 here. So this means that days with at least 10,000 steps are considered active. So what this means is we set min active steps to be 10,000. And then we, inside our constructor, we set each of these values to be 0, like that. And now we have constructed our step tracker. Next, we call active days on our object. Num active days is 0 right now. We haven't recorded any data, so we're going to be returning 0, and that is true. That's what the value returned is. Next, we call average steps. So because the total days recorded is 0, we're going to return 0.0, which is also correct. That is the value that is returned. Next, what we do is we add 9,000 daily steps. So we pass in 9,000 here. So we add 9,000 to our total number of steps. So now this number is 9,000. We increment total days. So total days is now 1. And then we check if 9,000 is greater than 10,000. Greater than or equal to. Unfortunately is not, so num active days stays at 0. We haven't had a day that were considered active yet. Then we call it again with 5,000. We add that to our total number of steps, so now we have 14,000. We increment total days by 1, so now it's 2. And then we check whether 5,000 is greater than or equal to 10,000. Unfortunately, it's not, so we do not increment the number of active days. Next, we call average steps. This method down here, total number of days is not 0, so we don't return this value here. We move on to this return statement. So we do 1.0 times the total number of steps, 14,000, which ends up being 14,000 represented as a double divided by the total number of days, which is 2. So that should give us 7,000 as a double. That is the correct return value. We call addDailySteps again, this time with 13,000 steps. We add that to our total number of steps, so that is 27,000 now. We increment the number of total days, so that should be 3 now. Next, we check if 13,000 is greater than or equal to 10,000. It is, so we finally have an active day. We can increment that variable. Next, we call active days, which should return the number of active days. This is finally 1. It's no longer 0, so we would return 1, which is correct. Then we call average steps again. The total number of days is not 0, so we move on to this return statement down here. So this would be 1.0 times 27,000, which gives us 27,000 as a double, divided by the total number of days, which is 3. So this will now give us 9,000 represented as a double. We're going to add 23,000, add daily steps, 23,000 as our parameter, add that to our total number of steps, which is now 50,000. We increment another total day. This number is 4. We check whether 23,000 is greater than or equal to 10,000. It is. So now we have 2 active days, and then we call addDailySteps again with 1,111. We add that to our total number of steps. So now we have 51,111. We increment the total number of days, 5. And then we check whether 1,111 is greater than or equal to 10,000. Unfortunately, it isn't, so we cannot increment num active days. We check how many active days we have had by calling the activeDays method. It's 2. We return 2, which is correct. And then our last statement, we are calling average steps again. Total number of days is greater than 0. It's not 0, so we don't return here. We move on to the other return statement, which is now 1.0 times 51,111 divided by the number of days, which is 5, which will give us 10,222.2, which is correct. Now we have finally checked all the statements and the return values of our StepTracker class, and we can feel confident that our code is correct. If we get rid of all the pseudocode, here is what our StepTracker class looks like. We've got our fields, we've got our constructor, addDailySteps, activeDays, and averageSteps. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.